Peter Weiss, and I have led a somewhat unusual life in that as a lawyer, I divided my time between representing clients in intellectual property matters. That's intellectual property includes trademarks and patents and that sort of thing. And the other half of my life, which gave me a lot more satisfaction, had to do with essentially three areas. One, peace and justice for everyone in the Middle East. Two, human rights, and in particular, the struggle against torture. And number three, working for a nuclear weapons-free world. I'm now emeritus in two of those approaches. The world desperately needs a working system of governance. And the closest we have to that is international law. And it doesn't matter whether international law is based on morality or whether it's based just on a bunch of lawmakers saying, we're making this law. You know, you can look at law as a set of do's and don'ts based on noble thoughts of morality or theology. Or you can look at law as being a traffic cop. You know, there's a lot going on and cars coming this way and that way. And we need somebody to stand there and say, stop and go. So many efforts have been made going back to time immemorial. You know, as long as there have been people in this world, there's been an effort to create some kind of regulation or governance. And it has taken the form of treaties, it has taken the form of institutions, and for almost anything that affects life in this society today, there is some kind of an international institution. And some of them work, and a lot of them don't work. I remember a talk I gave once about law, and one of the people in the audience was the president of the American Bar Association. And I said, you know, some people take international law very seriously, and other people just say, you know, as far as I'm concerned, and this is the head of the Bar Association speaking, international law is just a kind of confused morality. And we have to get away from that. We have to show people what international law can do. When you look at the premier institution in international law, which is the International Court of Justice in The Hague, which decides disputes between countries. It doesn't try individuals. That's up to the International Criminal Court. But the International Court of Justice, for instance, has resolved any number of border issues between countries who agreed to abide by the decision of the International Court of Justice, thereby avoiding another war. Perhaps the most important thing that can be done to make international law real is to take it seriously enough to get the violators of international law into prison, because there is not enough enforcement of the norms of international law. And a few centuries ago, Jonathan Swift put it very accurately when he said, "Law is a web which catches mites but lets the hornets through." Well, it's the place to go to when tension between two sovereign countries has reached a point where it may evolve into a war. And there are two ways that the International Court of Justice can come in at a point like that. It can be because both of the countries involved have, when they joined the court and when they signed on to the court, have also signed on to a commitment that they will be bound by the decision of the International Court. The other way, for those countries that have not signed on to what is called compulsory jurisdiction, can say, okay, we have a problem here, and we think this court is pretty impartial, and we're willing to let this court decide. I would say there have been essentially two situations in which I can take some pride. And one of them was going to the International Court of Justice with a resolution from the General Assembly of the United Nations asking the court to render an advisory opinion on the legality of the use and threat of use of nuclear weapons. And of course, none of these things are done by just one individual, but my colleagues and I worked very hard to get that General Assembly resolution that took us to the court, and then to help the countries participating in that issue with the legal argument which we offered to them to use. And I can tell you that we were very concerned at one point in this 2-week hearing at the International Court of Justice in The Hague, because we realized that countries were speaking in alphabetical order, and so the United Kingdom and the United States were going to be the last two countries. And judges who have a tendency in long, involved hearings sometimes fall asleep or lose their concentration. And we didn't want them to wake up with the words of two of the countries that would be most opposed to any kind of ruling from them. So at the very last minute, we got Zimbabwe with a Z to come in with a brief which we worked on with them all night. And it went very well. And the decision we got from the International Court of Justice essentially called the use and threat of use of nuclear weapons a violation of international law. The other one was a human rights case in which, again, my colleagues from the Center for Constitutional Rights and I were representing a woman from Paraguay whose 17-year-old brother had been tortured to death by the police of that country, which was a dictatorial country at the time, run by a general. The person who committed the torture that killed the young man was in the United States at the time. And we went to court to sue him on behalf of his sister and his father, who was back in Paraguay, on the basis of a law that was passed in 1789 in this country, which said that an alien, that is a foreigner, shall have access to our courts for a violation of the law of nations, which is what international law was called in the 18th century. When we went to court on the basis of that law, which had almost never been used in 200 years, and got a ruling from the federal courts in this country, which said, in effect, yes, torture is a violation of international law. You have the defendant here in this country. And it was the first case that ruled that somebody, a torturer, for instance, could be sued in this country on the basis of what he had done in a foreign country. So those are the two cases that I would mention when you ask me, what have I done? On July 7 of this year, 2017, the General Assembly of, well, it's not the General Assembly, a conference of member countries of the General Assembly of the United Nations adopted the text of a law banning, prohibiting the threat and use of nuclear weapons. And 122 countries voted for that text, which is now open for signatures so that it become a treaty. At the moment, it's just the text of a treaty. But of course, among these 122 countries that voted for it, you will not find the United States or France or China or Russia or North Korea or any of the 9 countries which have nuclear weapons. Nevertheless, that treaty gives a push to what you might call the culture of illegality of nuclear weapons. And the hope of the countries that worked to bring it into existence is that eventually, sooner or later, the nuclear weapon states will also adhere to it, and that will be the end of nuclear weapons in this world. Well, first you have to go to the resources that are available on the web. And I would say for nuclear weapons, if you want to work on that, you can go to the website of the Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy, which you will find under that name or its abbreviation LCNP. If you're more interested in human rights, which of course is much broader than torture, although torture is a very important part of it, you can go to the Center for Constitutional Rights, which has brought a number of these cases. And what people can do is what they have done in the recent past in relation to what is called the Ban Treaty, namely demonstrate to the countries that were called on to vote on that draft treaty that this is something of great concern to masses of people throughout the world, because a nuclear war could put an end to life on this planet. So people have been very active on that, and they will continue to be active now, not only in supporting the treaty, but also in going to our own government here and say to them, you know, what's the matter with you guys? There's a risk of another nuclear war, and you are out there modernizing nuclear weapons instead of getting rid of them. And our lawmakers have to hear that. Our Secretary of Defense has to hear that. And he, incidentally, may be somewhat sympathetic to that. But another former Secretary of Defense by the name of William Perry, who was the Secretary of Defense under President Clinton, has been very outspoken on this. And he has actually written his memoir and called it My Life on the Nuclear Brink, because he considered his lifelong, he's almost 90 years old now, he considered his lifelong fight against nuclear weapons the most important thing that he did, former Secretary of Defense. And he needs support from hundreds and thousands of people.